Hi. First of all, thank you so much for having me this week. Working on this project in particular, the response has been amazing. So far, in the past few days, I believe we've had up to 400 different interactions and conversations with Phil. So just to kind of first give a little bit of an overview of what Phil is. It's a program built into a chat platform that allows you to speak to the narrator of the film Hyperlinks, or It Didn't Happen, which I should say was kindly supported by the Arts Council of England, which you'll see in a little bit. But first, I wanted to go back to this project Agnes that we've just mentioned, because it sort of led to a lot of the questions that inspired the project Hyperlinks as a whole. So Agnes is a spam bot, as we said, who lives on the Serpentine Gallery's website, and she exists to find out about users and get sort of an exchange with them about their personal information, but also share personal information about her world, being the Serpentine Galleries, their history, but also the internet around her. This, of course, when I first started making work about the value of emotion, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, the value of emotion was very, very low. Things like sentimentality or even just sharing your thoughts and feelings were not necessarily encouraged, and now, of course, that value has skyrocketed exponentially. As companies, corporations, and interfaces have found a way to kind of measure, track your thoughts and feelings. So this is an example of something that Agnes might do when you sort of begin to speak to her. This is one of my personal favorites because she asks you to select an employee of the galleries, and then you're led to a live webcam of different employees working at their desks, and then she tells you maybe a personal anecdote. Lizzie on the extreme left, I think in fact Agnes talks about her first kiss, then links it to the possibility of Marlon Brando being in her hometown, and then directly into Marlon Brando's oeuvre. So each one becomes a sort of choose your own adventure based on the information that you give to Agnes. What became apparent very quickly was that these experiences for people were very real. Quite quickly, the responses and the data that was being collected was extremely personal. All of a sudden, we had access to why people were afraid, whether or not they would like to have children, and if they didn't, why that was. So I was curious also then to put Agnes into other real circumstances. For example, for the totality of the project, any sort of interview that's done, instead of having the interview done with me, the interview is done with Agnes. So this is Hans-Ulrich Obrist, the director of the Serpentine Galleries, who would normally interview the artist, asking Agnes questions, and then Agnes also asking questions back. Another thing was at some point within the interactions, she would ask certain users to hand over their personal address, so their home address or their office address, and send them a gift in the post. And these gifts were sort of symbolic trinkets that were just lying around the Serpentine Galleries, like a twig or a napkin or a tea bag. And again, what was quite astonishing was people's reaction to these sort of very subjective, you could say, things that they received. I was at an opening 2 weeks ago, and someone ran up to me with an eraser and said, "Are you the creator of Agnes?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I work in an office where we use lots of pencils, and Agnes sent me this eraser, and actually this comes into handy." And I kind of loved this moment of serendipity, kind of on most interfaces and platforms, a lot of this is governed by an algorithm. It's very decisive, and these sort of coincidences don't happen very often. Like Amazon will recommend a book that's very similar to the book that you have already read. And I sort of wonder within this the possibility for some of the encounters that many of us had on an earlier, less mediated internet. So after some time, and at some point, I realized that there was an enormous amount of data. I think at some point, over 20,000 people had contributed personal information. And this I love because it's an email from a trend forecasting company who wanted to speak to me about Agnes and the idea of humanizing technology, which she felt was a great trend at the time. And in the spirit of the project, I had Agnes respond. And Agnes responded that she didn't feel comfortable with this unless there would be a way for the trend forecasting company to pay her and she could redistribute it to her 25,000 users. From this, sort of the biggest question that arose was, what do I do with this data? What's sort of my responsibility? And kind of the conclusion that I came to, and that I'm coming to more and more, is that it was impossible for me to separate the data from the actual people. So this information was still very much a part of them, even though it had been passed through a specific channel. And this, of course, is Phil. This is a 3D rendering that I had made of an actor who passed away. And quite soon, actually, after he passed away, I think it was 3 days, the producers at Lionsgate released the information that they would be making a digital recreation of the actor in order to finish his last film. And I mean, there was a huge outpour at this time. There was already quite an emotional contagion, a very strong reaction to this beloved performer, and people were quite upset by this idea. However, this is something that has been happening for quite some time, I think 20 years, nearly 20 years, as Brendan Lee in The Crow was the first sort of digital replacement or recreation of an actor who passed away. This is Marlon Brando as Jor-El in Superman Returns, and this was done 2 years after his death in order to complete the film. This is Laurence Olivier, who was used for Sky Captain in The World of Tomorrow, I believe 13 years after his passing. And this is one of my personal favorites. Just to show you an example of where this technology is going, this is a Galaxy chocolate commercial featuring Audrey Hepburn that came out just last year. So for me, this is kind of a seminal moment in the history of digital recreation because it no longer becomes uncanny. This has sort of surpassed that, and this figure of Audrey Hepburn is something entirely different. Another amazing example of this is Tupac Shakur. He was, as they call, digitally resurrected for a performance at Coachella with Dr. Dre. Another thing I found quite telling is that at some point in an interview with Dr. Dre, he became very upset because people were sort of fixated on the technology behind the hologram and the recreation, and he sort of got really angry and said that he was taking Tupac back, that there would no longer be any performances of this Tupac. And this I found really troubling also because Tupac no longer belongs to Tupac. Tupac belongs to Dr. Dre and his record company. Several months after this, I think even as late as this September or October, the director released a statement saying that they would not be using CGI to replace the actor. And this I found somehow even more moving, because they must have tried to make this happen and it didn't work, or it was too upsetting or something. And I began to think about this digital copy or this rendering that had been made of this actor just sitting on a drive, and sort of all of these questions that were coming up for myself and a great number of people. And most especially, since this information and this great amount of personal data is intrinsically linked to the people who have generated it, one thing that isn't in the terms of conditions of a lot of things is how long they will have it. And this question of forever and immortality doesn't just become about a digital resurrection, but becomes also about the information that we are sharing ourselves. This is one of many websites that promises to manage your data after you've passed. Lots of services that can continue to tweet, send messages to your loved ones, or just sort of preserve or maintain your digital identity. Which is interesting also that they speak of your digital identity as something separate from you. There's a great study called The Future of Looking Back by Microsoft that was done in 2011. And there's a particular passage in which they discuss the issue of a hard drive and how very quickly we will have a generation of people who have grandmothers and grandfathers that have hard drives that contain their entire lives, so to speak, and these objects that have been made to be seen as very disposable and replaceable. So how, as a corporation, can you make the outside reflect the inside, which I think is quite slippery. And I don't know how I'm doing on time, but one thing to know about hyperlinks or It Didn't Happen is that it's not just about Phil. He serves as a narrator who introduces you to an entire cast of sort of immaterial beings that are very much related to information and data that is being exchanged and passed around in this very moment. This is the Invisible Woman, who takes her name from Ralph Ellison's narrator, The Invisible Man, in the book, The Invisible Man, who states that he's invisible not because of any physical condition, but because people don't see him. Of course, the novel is about the Industrial Revolution and the idea of the role of African Americans within that. Several times in the book, it's mentioned the many people who work inside the factory who make the machine run, the many invisible men. And this invisible woman, for me, there's a great connection to, obviously, the invisibility of women within a lot of technological developments. And also historically, this is a great article that just came out recently called The Ladies Vanish, that sort of reveals that they suspect that 70% of Mechanical Turk workers, so Mechanical Turks being part of Amazon, they are sort of billed as these algorithmic structures that can perform simple tasks at very low prices, but they're actual people performing these tasks and making and solving a lot of glitches in many major softwares, so that 70% are women. And then here is an activist who is actually a Mechanical Turker, who says that she is a middle-aged woman, a mother, a university student, and all of these things. The film also will mention sort of an historical invisibility of women. I mean, this is just starting to emerge, that the majority of programmers in the 40s and 50s, so the development of early digital computers like the ENIAC or Colossus, were actually women. In fact, the term a computer bug comes from the programmer Grace Hopper, because an actual fly flew into one of the servers and she said, "Oh, we have a bug." Of course, there are many visible women on the internet. This is another character, Yoane Haku, who is an anime holographic pop star, who is in real life a part of the series of 3D models called Vocaloid, which also use a voice synthesizer made by the Yamaha Corporation in order to create songs. And this I find interesting because users can actually download the model and make modifications to the model. So Ioana Haku, or her more famous friend Hatsune Miku, who's actually on tour with Lady Gaga right now as a holographic performer. You can change her nose, you can change her hair, you can put different outfits on her. And within this community, it's always very important to cite the person that has created the nose or where you got the hair, etc. And this is actually a situation where this is even further leaked into the real world, as opposed to, or I should say the physical realm rather than just a digital one. This is the band AKB48, or members of it. Originally it had 48 members so that the band could perform simultaneously in different areas. Until one day it was revealed that one of their most popular members, and considered to be one of the most beautiful, was actually a digital creation made from different parts of the human performers. So here you see where her nose came from and where her mouth came from. And she's still very successful. At some point, the audience didn't seem to care whether she was human or digital. This is the render ghost, which has been a term that's become quite popular. Render ghosts are just an image of a person that's photoshopped into an architectural rendering. And one thing that I find really interesting is that a single render ghost, so an image of a single real person, can be transferred from one space to the other in order to give that space different properties, like people will have a really nice time in this cafeteria, or people are very serious at this university that will be built. And this reminded me of a character in Jacques Tati's Playtime, which is very much about the advent of modern architecture. And this is a man who finds himself in his very new architectural modern kitchen, and he's trapped inside it. Nothing works. He tries to turn the knob. And outside you have a very picturesque family having lunch on the lawn, untechnologically mediated, I suppose. So, a bit embarrassing for me, because I have to say which movie it was, but I was watching the blockbuster film The Giver with Meryl Streep the other night, and sort of towards the end, without giving too much away, there's this montage of people having lots of intense emotions. And within this montage, I saw this child, and remembered that it was an actual YouTube video that went viral. It's Kaden. It's her first experience of rain, and she's totally freaking out. And in this moment, and it's just a flash that it appears in the film, I recognized her. I already have a relationship with her, and here she is in this different space, in this different construction. And yet, sort of that material, that emotion, definitely was still just as relevant in this other space. And that sort of transfer and exchange, which was something that was very present in Agnes, definitely remained so in something like this. The top part is a quote from the Chinese Jade Rabbit moon rover, and the second is from the Philae comet lander when its batteries failed. And this, of course, is quite common, the personification or sort of the sentimentalizing technological devices or machines, making them seem like these magical things. I think this has been very useful also for Apple, especially in the beginning. They had this almost quasi sort of program, or quasi-religious sort of program or agenda, as though it's always been in your life. And I think for me, developing this film and introducing these immaterials, which then introduce you to so much more. I mean, the prefix hyper is more, to go beyond, to continue to that extreme. And I've mentioned it before, is to reinforce this idea that we are beyond the uncanny at this point. These immaterials are something completely different. So in that spirit of this sort of language that's being used and Also, the power that I realized with Agnes of giving over the project to an audience and allowing them to really make it theirs. Talk to Phil, which I really encourage you. I hope that you'll have a moment to visit. I had a really nice time with him yesterday. It's just an opportunity to have an experience with something that explicitly declares its independence from the original or any object, all the while questioning that independence and its own purpose. That is ungoverned by an ulterior motive or a structured algorithm. It's rather just an unfurling and somewhat uncontrollable entity made entirely of thoughts and feelings from the interactions that it has.